Population ecology is the study of individuals of a single type of organism living in a single place at a single time. There's a number of ecological terms that are important for population ecology as well for all other areas of ecology. So I want to quickly review some of the important terminology that ecologists use. So the first one is niche. And niche in ecological terms, it has a sort of a formal mathematical definition and then more of a sort of common sense definition. So I'm going to use more of an informal definition. So it is the totality of the role, function, and place of an organism. So it includes where the organism is found, both in terms of types of habitats, geographical areas. It would include whether or not an organism is found underground, above ground, whether or not it forages at night or during the day. It includes the resources used by animals and plants. It includes the other organisms that an organism interacts with. So for instance, for a plant, it would include not only the resources the plant uses, but also its interactions with organisms with which it competes, other plants as well as animals that might eat or pollinate the flowers of the plant. Habitat is one of the aspects of niche. So habitat is where an organism lives. So that would include the place both in terms of geographic as well as the type of habitat in which it would live. A population is all the individuals of one species living in a particular time and place. So sometimes a population is defined fairly naturally by boundaries of the population, but often it's something that's determined by the researcher. So a researcher would set out to study some species, and they would pick what they think are the borders of that population, and they would study it for some particular period of time. Community is a higher level of organization. So population is all individuals of one species. A community is individuals of multiple species. So it's all the populations of different organisms living, again, in a particular place and time. Sometimes ecologists will define a community to be some subset of the entire community. So it wouldn't be unusual to have ecologists talk about something like a bird community, where they pick some subset of the larger ecological community. Ecosystem includes all the biotic components, so it includes the community as well as the abiotic components. So ecosystem includes things like abiotic factors as well as the cycling of nutrients. And biome is a way of describing or categorizing a particular type of ecosystem. So as there's variation in precipitation and temperature, the types of animals and the types of plants that occur in different conditions varies. And for a particular type of dominant characteristic plant, that would be described as a biome. So for instance, people might talk about a desert biome, and there's a particular type of plants and animals that occur in a desert. Or they may talk about something like a grassland, where again, there's a characteristic type of plant that occurs in that. And so the term to describe that catch-all of plants and animals that characterize a particular set of conditions over large geographic areas is biome. One of the simplest ways to describe a population is to look at its distribution across the landscape or within a habitat. And for describing the spatial distributions of populations, there's three categories. One of them is random. And random may not look like things are dispersed particularly randomly. So random in the sense that ecologists would say random is that the distribution of individual plants and animals is independent of the distributions of other plants and animals. So the mathematical distribution that describes that is a Poisson distribution. So that is taking each point and determining its location independently of all the other points. So within that, you'll get what appear to be some spots where organisms are isolated from each other, but you also will get some degree of clumping, just by the random chance of individuals landing next to each other. So in comparison to that random distribution, the two possibilities are that they're more clumped than random, or the distributions of organisms are less clumped than random. So for clumped distribution, that's where organisms tend to occur with each other, and then you get big areas where very few of them occur. One of the things that could lead to populations being clumped is if they're adapted to a particular set of conditions. So you can imagine that across the landscape, there are areas where, let's say that the vegetation is found in pockets, little depressions in the landscape. They're found there clumped near each other because the resources they need all occur in the same place. Another reason you may get organisms clumped would be because offspring don't disperse very far from their parents. If you have an oak tree growing out in the middle of a forest, you can imagine that the offspring, the acorns of that oak tree, would fall fairly close to the tree. So just because the offspring didn't get very far from the parent, you could get clumped distributions, even though the habitat is suitable throughout the forest. The other type of distribution would be over-dispersed or uniformly distributed. So you never find clumps of individuals. They're more dispersed, more away from each other than if they were located independently from each other. Usually this is indicative of strong intraspecific competition. So if individuals compete very strongly for resources, there might be a limit to how closely they can occur to each other. So in this case, it's some sort of density-dependent process, something like resource uptake, or it may be something such as herbivores that feed on one plant exert a very strong influence on offspring of that plant, something that causes the distributions of individuals to be far apart from each other. Then rather than getting things distributed randomly, you get an over-dispersed, very uniform, almost grid-like distribution of plants or animals on the landscape. In addition to studying the distribution of populations across space, ecologists often study the distribution of individuals in different ages or stages within a population. For some organisms, it may be easy to classify them into ages, so the years or days of age, something of that sort. For other populations, for other types of species, it might be fairly difficult to classify them into ages, and then ecologists may classify them instead into stages. So for instance, for humans, you could classify them into ages, something like 0 to 5 years. You could also classify humans in terms of stages, infant, adolescent, reproductive, and post-reproductive. Well, for something like plants, it might be seeds, seedlings, saplings, and mature trees. By looking at the distribution of individuals in these different ages or stages, you can get insights into the mortality risks at different ages. You can understand whether or not a population is likely to be growing or shrinking. If births and deaths depend on ages, populations that have the same demographic parameters, the same birth rates and death rates at different ages, may grow very differently in the future depending on their current age distribution. Generally speaking, populations that have very large pre-reproductive age structure have more potential to grow than ones where most of the population is in a post-reproductive stage. The growth of populations can be described with simple mathematical models. In these models, growth rate is determined by 4 processes: immigration, emigration, so the entering of individuals into a population or the exit of individuals from a population, and by births and deaths. Those 4 factors together are all brought into a single growth rate term and 2 different types of mathematical models. In one type of model, reproduction, births, deaths, immigration, all happen continuously over time. In these models where the entry and exit of individuals from a population happen continuously, ecologists use differential equations to describe the growth of populations. In that type of model, the dynamics of a population will look like an increasing curve, so a geometrically increasing curve that increases ever more rapidly with a very smooth trajectory. So in that type of model, there's 3 possible ways that a population can behave. One would be if it has a growth rate which is positive, it will increase without bound to infinity. If there's just enough birth and immigration to balance deaths and emigration, the population would remain constant over time. If emigration and deaths exceed births and immigration, the population would have a negative growth rate and it would decrease down to a population size of 0. In the other type of population model, another one of these density-independent models, reproduction or deaths could happen at certain times during the year. So for instance, if you looked at a population of deer, fawns tend to be all born about the same time of year. So it isn't that there's fawns being born all the time. There's periods where fawns tend to be born, and there's periods of relatively high mortality also for adult deer. In those cases where population processes don't happen continuously throughout time, ecologists use difference equations with single discrete chunks of time. In those types of models, the general characteristics of the population, the dynamics of increasing and decreasing, are generally the same. If the population growth rate is positive, it would increase without bound in an ever-increasing accelerating curve. But rather than being a smooth curve in this discrete model with synchronized reproduction, it would be a stair step up to infinity. If the population growth rate is 0, it would look exactly the same as the one with continuous time. It would just be a constant flat line. The other possibility where population growth rate is negative, it would take a stair step down towards 0 instead of a smooth approach down towards 0. Population models that assume that there's no limit to the growth of populations are not a very realistic representation for most natural populations. As populations increase and become more and more dense, eventually births will decrease, mortality increases, or emigration will change, and the population won't be able to increase without bound. For instance, if a population gets to be very large, food might become limiting, space might become limiting, and births would decrease, and deaths would increase. In those models, that size at which the population stops growing is usually referred to as the carrying capacity. As a population is very close to 0 and very far away from carrying capacity, the population will grow just as if it were in a density-independent population model. As the population starts to approach the carrying capacity, the per capita growth rate is going to decrease. So on a per individual basis, as the population gets closer to carrying capacity, population growth rate is going to decrease on a per capita basis. So each individual is going to have a higher risk of dying and is going to have a lower reproductive output. As the population continues to approach carrying capacity, when it gets to half the carrying capacity, the number of individuals in the population is relatively high, and the per capita success is still reasonably high, and that is where the population grows at the fastest rate. So at a very low population size, a very small number of individuals have a very high per capita success. As the point of halfway to carrying capacity is reached, a reasonably high number of individuals have a reasonably high per capita success rate. And then as the population gets very close to carrying capacity, a large number of individuals in the population have a very low per capita success. For a model with continuous time, where reproduction and mortality happens throughout time, the model can give just 3 different types of dynamics. One of them, if the population growth rate is positive, it will approach carrying capacity with a sigmoidal S-shaped curve. At low population size, it would look like a density-independent model. As it reaches half of carrying capacity, it'll have an inflection point, and then the growth rate would decrease and it will smoothly approach carrying capacity. If the population growth rate is 0, then the population will stay constant. In a density-independent model, the only time this would happen is if the population starts at carrying capacity. In that case, it will just remain at carrying capacity continuously for all time. The third possibility is a population that already is higher than carrying capacity. And in that case, it will decrease down to carrying capacity in a smooth curve where it approaches carrying capacity asymptotically. In models where there is synchronous reproduction, where birth and mortality don't happen at equal chance at all times, the dynamics can be much more complicated. In those cases where carrying capacity and births and deaths don't have instantaneous constant feedback, the population has the potential to overshoot carrying capacity. For instance, a deer may breed during a time when food is abundant. By the time the fawn is born, food resources might be extremely limiting. In that case, the population could have a high number of births at a time when carrying capacity has already been exceeded. In those cases where the population overshoots carrying capacity, it will come back down towards carrying capacity again. But again, if there is not instantaneous feedback between population size and births and deaths, the population can again overshoot carrying capacity and go down below carrying capacity. In some cases, the population might never reach carrying capacity and may continuously cycle above and below carrying capacity. In population growth models where time is discrete or where there is a time delay built into a continuous time model, the dynamics of the population go through a series of predictable behaviors as population growth rate increases. When population growth rate is low or time delays are very short, the population will at first smoothly approach carrying capacity, just as in a continuous logistic model where there are no time delays. As the population growth rate increases, the population will overshoot carrying capacity, but then it will have a series of decreasing overshoot and undershooting of carrying capacity, and the population will reach carrying capacity. As the population growth rate gets increasingly high, this overshooting and undershooting of carrying capacity will be more severe, and it will take a longer time for the population to reach carrying capacity. As the population growth rate gets sufficiently high, it may never reach carrying capacity, and it will go into sustained population cycles. At first, this would be a 2-point cycle, where the population will overshoot carrying capacity and then undershoot carrying capacity, and the size of those overshooting and undershooting going too far and too far above and below carrying capacity will be the same. It'll be in a 2-point cycle. As population growth rate gets still higher, the population will go into more complex cycles where there are a number of overshoot and undershoot points, and the population can go to 4, 8, 16-point cycles. As population growth rate gets faster and faster, these overshooting and undershooting of carrying capacity gets more and more severe, and the population will go into what ecologists refer to as chaos. In chaos, the population will appear to be unpredictable, and the dynamics will appear to be random and not the result of demographic processes, when really they could be completely determined by population size. But there's so little feedback between population size and birth and deaths that the population appears to be undetermined and random. In natural populations, organisms show density-dependent growth, and in natural populations, as population density increases, per capita growth rates of populations decrease. Currently, human populations do not show this type of behavior. Human populations, the per capita growth rate has been increasing through time. At the same time, populations have been increasing in density. So rather than having negative density dependence for human population, there has been a positive density dependence. Ecologists don't know what carrying capacity for humans will be on the planet, but eventually, if the population continues to increase at the rate that it has been, then human population growth will have to slow, and human population size will not be able to continue to increase. So eventually human population growth will look like more typical natural population growth, and there should be negative density dependence at some point as carrying capacity is reached. Density-independent factors are things that affect the growth of a population independent of the population size. Often these are environmental factors such as extreme cold, drought, tornadoes, or volcanic eruptions. For many organisms, harsh abiotic conditions keep populations far from carrying capacity much of the time. Such species show little density-dependent regulation much of the time. Density-dependent effects of specialist herbivores and diseases are thought to be important in promoting the high diversity of tropical rainforests. Seedlings growing in the vicinity of their parents experience higher losses than those that are growing distant from conspecifics. In general, plants with a diverse range of other plants growing in their vicinity experience lower herbivory and disease than those growing in a monoculture. If plants are sown at high densities, the number of plants surviving decreases as they grow in stature. This is referred to as self-thinning. Animals also show density-dependent regulation. As density increases, deaths will increase from limited food, higher disease frequencies, and other factors. Animals in crowded populations are less likely to breed, and their success in food-limited, crowded conditions is lower. For our selected species, R refers to the growth rate term in the Logistic population growth model. For these species, population sizes and mortality tend to be variable and unpredictable. Since populations are often far from carrying capacity, referred to as K, intraspecific competition is often weak. Selection tends to favor individuals with rapid development, high and early reproduction that is not repeated, small body sizes, high resource requirements, and short lives. The potential for populations of R-selected species to grow is large. In contrast, K-selected species have more constant mortality and population sizes that are often close to carrying capacity. Intraspecific competition tends to be strong. Selection favors slower development rate, late repeated reproduction, long lives, and efficient use of resources.